Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into what it truly means to be the church and saints God seeks, not the church I think of. Our sources for this exploration come from a pretty compelling YouTube meditation, drawing on insights from Paul's epistles, historical biblical context, and, well, their striking relevance to modern faith.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how the challenges faced by those early Christian communities, particularly, those in Paul's time, continue to echo in churches today. Our mission really is to understand God's original intention versus maybe these human-made religious frameworks that can crop up.
Right, so the source immediately drops us into the setting of Paul's letter to Titus. It describes the church in Crete. Apparently it wasn't very well organized, and some Jewish Christians were causing confusion. They were insisting on legalistic practices like circumcision and sticking to these traditions of the elders.
And that raises a big question, doesn't it? Why did these legalistic claims, arguing for practices beyond just believing in Jesus, why did they persist? Well, the source traces this back to the historical context of the Babylonian exile. There was this national awakening to observe the law, but it kind of veered off course. Instead of getting God's intention, the law became this framework of, if you keep it well, you'll be blessed. If not, you'll be cursed. Sort of transactional. And this led to an obsession with religious methods and traditions, things exemplified by the Talmud and Mishna later on.
Okay, so what does this mean for Jesus' teachings then? The source highlights Mark chapter 7, verses 8 and 9. That's where Jesus himself rebuked those who let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men.
Exactly. It wasn't about a true relationship with God anymore, but more like a religious discipline just to gain blessings. Performing, not relating.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting for us today. The source argues this historical mistake is lamentable because it's being repeated in the church today.
Yeah, this contemporary legalism. It presents believing in Jesus not for knowing God's true heart, but, well, as a method to go to heaven and receive blessings, or applying that idea that sincerity moves heaven as if our effort dictates God's response rather than his grace.
That's a subtle shift, but huge implications.
Huge. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source describes how this mindset can turn saints into slaves of the church building, slaves of religion.
Yeah.
Can lead to a sort of double life where, worldly values mix with religious acts that are thought to just shake off sin on Sunday.
So what's the core issue here? The fundamental problem, according to the source, is not knowing God's intended purpose for the church and for us as saints.
Yeah.
And when a community loses that purpose, it becomes, and this sounds harsh, a lump of corruption.
It does sound harsh. But the source points to how seriously God takes this. It cites Isaiah chapter 1, verses 10 to 13. That's where God expresses, frankly, disgust with meaningless offerings and worthless assemblies if they lack his true heart and purpose.
So the actions themselves aren't enough.
Not at all. Worship without God's purpose behind it is simply unacceptable to him. It misses the entire point.
Okay, so that brings us back to Paul's advice to Titus and Crete. It was actually very practical, wasn't it?
Very practical. Emphasize specific behavioral guidelines and good deeds. Actively refute false teachers and demand strict qualifications for leaders. Why? Because the world sees God through the words and lives of leaders. That's a heavy responsibility.
Yeah, it really is.
And what's fascinating here, the core truth that emerges, is that God gave the law for freedom, not to trap us within some religious framework. He liberates people. He isn't meant to be a religious power used for profit or personal desires.
So the church isn't a means to an end for us.
Exactly. The true purpose of the church is to be where God's children purchased with the blood of God's Son, Jesus Christ, dwell. That's the core identity, living according to God's word and becoming lights in their given generation. It's fundamentally not a space just to satisfy personal desires.
So bringing this deep dive kind of full circle, what does this all mean for you listening right now?
Well, as you reflect on this, maybe consider, are you truly living in obedience to God's revealed purpose for the church and your calling as a saint with Christ really as the head? Or are you perhaps unknowingly approaching the church more as a place for God to fulfill your desires, maybe give you stability? It's a searching question.
It really is. This whole deep dive compels us to ask, what truly distinguishes a true church of God and true saints of God in our generation from, well, just a bustling religious gathering? Something to mull over until next time.